From my story to your story, let's talk about grief. I will share my own grief journey, along with interviewing others about their path of sorrow and healing. I hope that you, the listener, will hear something that helps as you navigate your own grief, and that God will be glorified along the way. This content is meant as a discussion and not to give professional help. Let's get started.
So tell me about that. One of the things you said was you felt like you were just basically told you could not grieve or should not grieve.
I was brought up, I was expected to behave in a certain way and not to show my feelings. It was the type of thing, this is God's will, so accept it.
Okay.
That was more or less the way I would say it. And it was very difficult, but I was to think about what other people would think.
You were how old again when you
I was
died?
18.
You were 18 when you died, so this was really young.
It was my first year of college.
The burial. Oh, this is a funny story, and like you said, your dad would think it was funny, but I meant your grandfather because that's in the story. But yes. So what happened at the burial?
That's my Nana. If you're watching on YouTube, to like and subscribe. If you are listening on the podcast, please like and follow. We would love for you to do that now to help our channel grow and become a blessing to others.
Today I have one of my longtime friends and mentors, Tena Wokaty. We have gone to church together for, I want to say 34.
At least.
No, it would be more like 40 years. Sorry, more like 40 years now. Mm-hmm. And we also worked together for a while. So her and I were in our church parking lot talking one day about just the Speak Your Grief with Sonia and the episodes and so forth. And she said this quote, well, actually I'm going to let you say that quote to me that you said.
Okay. When you lose your parents, you lose your past. When you lose your spouse, you lose your present. And when you lose your children, you lose your future.
And I just thought that was so profound, especially the part when you lose your children, you lose your future. And I got to thinking about that. And, you know, you're around someone for a while and you forget what they've gone through in their past. And Tena Wokaty has gone through losing her parents, losing her sister, and losing a son. So we're going to unpack some of that in probably a 3-part series. And today we are going to talk about how certain generations or certain family dynamics you are expected not to grieve. And with that, we're also going to talk about the loss of her dad. So tell me about that. One of the things you said was you felt like you were just basically told you could not grieve or should not grieve.
I was brought up by a very proper young lady. My mother had gone through the depression and different things like that. I was expected to behave in a certain way and not to show my feelings.
Okay.
And that was hard sometimes, but that's just what I was taught. It was the type of thing, this is God's will, so accept it.
Okay.
You know, that was more or less the way I would say it. And it was very difficult, but I was to think about what other people would think. And that made it a little difficult to grow up feeling that way, I guess.
So I think both of those are well worded to put into perspective what some people feel about grief. That if you're a Christian, this is God's will, so just accept it, and you're not necessarily processing it. Mm-hmm. And then that it was proper. So I know one of the things you mentioned to me was, I think since then, you've done your own thinking through about biblically that we are supposed to grieve.
Right.
And you mentioned a verse from Romans. What was it you were kind of pointing out with that?
Well, the verse, there was one verse that says Jesus wept.
Right.
And we know that he wept when Lazarus died, mm-hmm. and we know that he already knew that Lazarus was going to die, but I think he had so much love for Lazarus and for his sisters that he grieved with them.
Exactly. And you mentioned in Romans, it talks about weeping with those that weep. And I think that's important for us to understand is it is okay to openly weep or to have a time of grief and for that grief to continue. I know we learn to carry it differently. It doesn't go away. But it's also important for us to realize that Christ had tender-hearted feelings toward people in grief, and he grieved with them. And so we want to make sure that people do grieve in a way that they're not suppressing it and holding it back all the time. So the first life-changing grief that you went through was losing your dad. If you want to start with that and tell me about that. And you lost him at a relatively young age, but give us some history about you and your dad and your relationship.
Well, I'll start with my mom getting saved because that changed our family. We had a pastor that had come to the area, and he made it his purpose to knock on doors and present the gospel. And my mother was ready, and the first time she heard the plan of salvation, she accepted. My daddy, it took him a little bit longer, like 11 years, because he was still trying to do everything on his own. I was 11 when Daddy got saved, and he was a different person, and everyone that knew him knew that. When I was 12, he had his first heart attack. His first heart attack was not what we would call a serious one, but it was the first one.
Okay.
And then he had, between the time that I was 12 and the time I was 18, he had 3 heart attacks, and we were called in several times to say that Daddy probably would not make it, but he did. And he had 2 strokes. The second stroke, he was in the doctor's office, and the doctor was examining his neck. It was a regular routine thing, and he was examining his neck, and Daddy had a stroke.
Right there while the doctor was touching his neck.
Was touching his neck.
Wow.
And they took him by ambulance to the hospital. We went with him. And when he was in the hospital, we had been told before this could be this. But this time when he was in the hospital, the doctor came in and told him that he was paralyzed on his left side.
Okay.
And Daddy had taken care of his dad, who was paralyzed. And Daddy was also a barber. That was his profession, so he needed his arm. And he told the doctor that he didn't mind dying, but that he would not be paralyzed. So when I came to see him that day, he had his arm laying out on the bed, and he said, put your hand in mine. And I put my hand in his, and at first I really thought that he thought maybe he was moving, but wasn't, because there was no movement there. And he said, just leave it there. And finally, after a few minutes, he closed his hand on mine and squeezed it. And
he was determined.
He was determined. The doctor was a longtime friend of his, and he told him he was just too stubborn to die. But he told us that he had a very strong will to live.
Oh, wow.
So
that's amazing. And then you said during this time he had stents and bypasses and other surgeries. Or no, I'm sorry, you were saying that was all new.
Right.
And he went to Duke.
All of this was experimental, I guess you would say.
Okay.
We're going back a long ways. This was in the 1960s, and they had just started the bypass surgery, the stents, all of this at Duke, and they had done 3.
Oh, wow.
So they talked to Daddy, and they said they would do the surgery, and that he would have a 40% chance of coming out of the surgery. And that if he didn't have the surgery, they couldn't promise anything. So he told them, thank you, he appreciated it, but he would take whatever years or whatever days the Lord gave him. And he did live 3 years after that. So
when you think about that at that time, medically, that's so commonplace for us now, and usually the results are good. But if you were on the other side of that, and it was a brand new procedure, it would be terrifying, to decide to do those kinds of things. So he had 3 more years after that. And you mentioned like when you were in high school, he was not able to go to your graduation. Was he ill from the heart things at that time?
They were very careful with him. He was restricted, where probably today he would not have been.
Okay.
He wasn't allowed to climb a lot of stairs.
Oh, okay.
And he could not have come to the graduation without doing that.
Sure.
So he stayed at home, and then I came home and showed him my diploma and that type of thing. But that was the first thing I think that he missed. When I went to college, he was well enough to come the first of the when they had the open house week, the parents' week. And he was very proud of his daughters because he was on his own at 15.
Oh.
And he had a third grade education. And to have one daughter that was a nurse and another was a teacher, that was the proud. Made him very proud.
Big deal at that time. So your dad and mom were able to come to the Parents' Day, and you mentioned your sister, who was a nurse. You mentioned his education, and then let's see, you went to school in South Carolina.
I went to Bob Jones my third year, but the first 2 years we lived in North Carolina, and I went to a school that was about 45 minutes.
And you want
that
to
was
say
45
that.
minutes.
Okay, so you mentioned you were able to come back and forth at this point.
Yes.
Okay.
I came back every weekend, and I was home Thanksgiving and had spent the week there, and I mentioned to you that was the week that John F. Kennedy died.
Yes.
And it was like the whole world went into mourning during that time. And Daddy and I, were watching some of it on television. And when it got time for me to go back to school, I could tell that he didn't feel well. And I asked him if I could stay home. I knew what he was going to say, but I asked if I could stay home. And he usually would joke with me and tease with me, but he was very serious. And he told me that if he had his way, he would just lock the doors to keep my mother and my sister and the new grandson with him. But he also told me that I was going to have to live without him because he was sure. And he told me that he wanted me, to live a good life. And he told me he loved me, which he usually didn't. He was, everything was. And he said that, that I had to go back to school. But sometimes you have a feeling.
Was that hard? I'm sure just terribly hard to go back.
It was. And I went back on Sunday. And Tuesday night, after lights were out, our dorm supervisor came to the door and said that my uncle was there to take me home. My aunt and uncle lived down the street from where the college was, so I knew there was only one reason he would come to take me home. And when we got in the car, he was joking and telling me different things, and I said, maybe joking wasn't the word, but he was trying to keep it light.
Right.
And I said, you need to tell me that my daddy has died. And so he said, that he had.
Okay.
And so, that was final. I don't think we said anything else on the way home. When we got home, I don't know what I was expecting, but when I went into the house, I went to Mom and Daddy's room. Of course, Daddy wasn't there. My sister was, and I asked her where he was. Sometimes you just don't focus in.
Right.
And I asked where he was, and she said, well, they've already taken him away. And I remember thinking that's not fair. I didn't get to see him. Every time he was in the hospital, I spent days there just sitting in a chair, and I didn't always go to school.
Right.
But I just wanted to sit with him. But of course that wasn't possible. The next morning when I got up, I told my mother I was going to go for a ride, and she didn't question me, but I drove to the funeral home.
Okay.
The funeral director and my dad had been barbers together years and years before. So he knew me and knew our family. So I went to the funeral home, and it wasn't time for the funeral home to be open, and there were no viewing or anything like that. So he asked me what I was doing there, and I said I'd like to sit with my daddy.
Oh, wow.
And he hugged me and said, well, of course you can.
Okay.
And so he said, wait here, let me get him ready. And so I had a good hour to go back in and sit with my daddy, just him and I again.
And that was important to you. And
yes.
I think it is important to realize that it's different for everybody. Some people
right.
don't want to see the body afterwards, but some people, it's really important to them to be able to be there or have a moment with them.
Right.
So it was very important to you to have
time alone
with your dad there at the funeral home. That was not creepy to you. Some people,
no.
That's creepy, but for you, you just wanted that
right.
last time to say goodbyes and be with his body. And then you were talking about, even at that time, his funeral was different from, like we talk about celebration of life
right.
today, but that was not a common term back then.
No, it wasn't. But I didn't think of it then, but when I was going over in my mind the things that happened, I thought that was a perfect example, because that's what they did. They celebrated Daddy's life. I remember I was 18, but I remember thinking, why are all these people here? I mean, but I didn't realize how many lives he had really touched. The choir sang, it was on a Thursday morning, and the preacher gave Daddy's testimony. And I remember that every time he would come to the hospital, before he would leave, he would ask Daddy, he said, are you ready to meet your Savior? Mm-hmm. And Daddy would always say, I'm ready when the Lord's ready.
Oh, wow, what a testimony. And how important that was to you to hear
yes.
that. And just, I think sometimes we forget that saying that out loud in front of our children and our grandchildren, mm-hmm. Is a great reassurance to them that we're ready and we know we're going to heaven and we know we're going to be with Jesus. The burial. Oh, this is a funny story. And like you said, your dad would think it was funny, but I mentioned grandfather because that's in the story. But yes. So what happened at the burial?
Well, we were about 50 miles away, and we were going back to my mother's home, and Daddy was to be buried next to where she was to be buried. And as we went down there, we got to there was a long line of people that were going with us. There were also people that lived in the area that did not come to the funeral, were going to the graveside. And when we got there, my mother got out of the car and she said, they dug the wrong grave.
I don't think I've ever heard of that happening.
Well, we were there, and but what they had done is my granddaddy was still alive. He came to live with Mother and I, and they dug his grave. Okay. And so the funeral director I think he said he had never had this happen before, but we had to do something because we had a grave that was empty that needed to be filled. We had a grave that had, needed to be empty. So we went to, it was a little town, and we went to a little restaurant, and I think we just kind of shocked everybody because there were so many people and it was lunchtime.
Right.
But we stayed there ever how long it took, I don't know, for them to dig Daddy's grave and fill in Granddaddy's grave.
Oh, my goodness.
So we finally came back and everything was taken care of. But I can remember just thinking about Daddy and thinking how funny he would think that was.
Yes, so he would get a kick out of that. And you got to wonder if the Lord let him know that
maybe
happened and if he was laughing about it. So you were talking about when you go back to school, your dad's passed away. You have to leave and go back to school. What was that like?
I remember that I tried to act like everything was just like it had been. People, especially if you're talking about young people, they don't know how to deal with someone whose father has just died because it's not the normal.
Because you were how old again when your dad died?
I was 18.
You were 18 when he died, so this was really young.
It was my first year of college, and I went back because I knew he told me to go back. Okay. So when I went back, I think I tried to act normal. But I could remember, and I thought, maybe this is wrong, but I told the Lord that if something should happen, I need to wake up the next morning. That would be fine. I knew I was a Christian. I knew I couldn't do anything, but I just knew that that if I didn't wake up, that would be okay. I would be with the Lord, and I'd be with Daddy. So
how much you were missing him and how much grief you were going through. I can remember feeling that way. I remember as a wife feeling the same way when Don passed, that it would be fine if I went on to heaven now. And it was really only the fact that I didn't want my kids to go through the grief of both a dad and a mom, that of course I was kind of like, no, I really want to be here if the Lord will let me be here. So I do remember that struggle. We've talked about how grief can affect the physical body. You had some things, maybe from holding it in, or maybe just the effect of grief in general. You had some things later.
I think most of it was holding it in. And my sister, who was a nurse, saw a change in me. And she made an appointment with the doctor that she had worked with. And the Lord always knows that he always, prevents some things. And when they were going through everything, they did find tests and different things. They did find something that needed to be taken care of.
Okay.
And that, I'm sure, I would never have known. But that was one way that he worked in that. But during the process, the doctor told my sister and I, went through with both of us what was going on. And then he said that I needed to stand up for myself, that I needed to take care of myself, and I needed to grieve.
Wow.
He didn't say it quite that politely.
I'm sure not.
But that's what he was saying, that I had to take care of myself.
And he knew that you were holding it all in for some reason, or the way your family handled things, or the people around you, or even just what you thought was best.
Well, my sister worked with him, so he kind of knew
your situation.
Our situation, yes.
Wow. Do you think that helped you to have a doctor say it's okay to go ahead and grieve?
Yes, I'm sure it did.
That's important. Okay, and then we talked about so tell me what that was like as far as losing your dad at 18. That's really young to lose your dad. So what kind of things that sets you up for he's missing all the milestones?
Right. Well, I graduated from college and he was not there. That was a big thing, because that was a big thing for him, for me to go to college.
Sure.
So he was not there for that. That was hard. When Bob and I were engaged, he talked to my mother, but I missed the fact that he should have known my dad, or I felt like he should have known my dad. So those were big things. Of course, when the children come along, they didn't have a granddad. I had to tell them as much as I could about him, but I knew they would have loved him. I have one son that reminds me quite a bit of him. He has that same dry sense of humor that Daddy had, and I've told him before that, every once in a while he'll say something, and I said, "That's your granddad coming out." So there are things there that you miss all along, that you think. When I got married, my brother-in-law gave me away.
Okay.
So he tried his best. He was my sister was already married and had a child when Daddy died. So he tried his best to step in, and he did keep an eye on me, and that type of thing. And he did give me away, which we all felt like that was a person to do it. So
that's sweet that there was someone special in your life that could do that for you. What do you think? How do you think you coped with that back then, as far as just the fact that your dad wasn't able to be there?
Silently. The way I coped with everything, I once in a while, if I was by myself, I would let it out. I do remember going home one day when I was living with Mother, and we were both working, and I went home and I looked in one bedroom. That's where my granddaddy stayed, and he had died. And I went back to my mom and dad's bedroom, and it was just the sense of everybody is gone type of thing. And I remember, I don't cry much, But I remember crying, and my mother called for something and said, she said, "What in the world's wrong with you?" And I said, and I know it sounds ridiculous. I said, "Well, Daddy's not here and Granddaddy's not here."
Right.
And so she
that doesn't sound ridiculous to me at all.
But that's the way I felt. So I did let it out every once in a while when I was by myself.
Do you think things were precious to you that were his? Did you hang on to things that were his and have memories of things that were his? Did those become dear to you because you couldn't even express, the grief?
Yes, I do. I have several things. Bob has a watch that was his, and I have things from the advertisements for the barber shop and things that probably wouldn't mean a lot to anybody else. But I have his wallet and some pictures that were in it, and I have a lot of things that remind me of him.
And you showed me a picture of your childhood home, and then something happened to that, and you felt like a lot of the grief that comes from losing like a part of your history, and obviously that was one of your attachments to your family, and especially your dad. What happened to that?
Because of Daddy's condition, I grew up in a 5-bedroom house, and when Daddy got sick, he couldn't go upstairs to the 4 bedrooms.
Okay.
So they had to put another bedroom downstairs. And but that was the house that I grew up in, my sister and I. And when I went to college, they decided that house was too big. Daddy was sick, and so they decided to sell the house. I knew all that, and they had bought a little house. And I came back from college. They had sold it to an oil company. And when I came back, I drove by the house, or thought I was going to drive by the house. I knew all this, but the house was gone. They had completely demolished it to put up other buildings, a little mini mall type thing. And I just remember that was right before Daddy died. And I just remember feeling then like I had lost my childhood, everything.
Right.
I had lived there so long. That was a physical thing, but yet it was something that I remembered even after Daddy was gone, that I had lost.
Yes, that attachment or that connection with him and losing your home. And then one of the things that you and I have talked about is, when does grief stop?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
I remember that because you and I had been talking, I was thinking about it, I guess, but this Father's Day was hard for me.
Isn't that crazy? How many years later?
It's been 60 years.
Yes.
So.
But you don't lose the love you had for that person or the desire to have been around them.
Right.
And probably because you've been writing about it and thinking about it, talking to me about it, it's stirred up things that you've just set aside for a little while or something. Absolutely. But you talked about sometimes it drives us to do something or be productive. What did you said you did some ancestry research?
I decided to find out as much as I could, because Daddy did not really talk about himself, and I know why, but there were things that I didn't know about him. I didn't know he was one of 9 siblings until I started the research.
Okay.
But I decided to go back as far as I could, and I was surprised that I could go all the way back to England. Wow. And the first Winstead that came over to Lancaster County in the Northern Neck, and then I traced it all the way back. So I have... my kids are all excited about that. They think that's great.
Something special about that.
I made something for each one of them so that they can look back and see who their granddaddy was.
That's neat. A way for them to connect with somebody they didn't even get to meet.
Right.
So I'm glad you have that in your life. So we'll also go ahead into that you lost your sister. And I should say, you lost your mom in there in between, correct?
I lost Troy. We lost Troy before we lost Madeline.
Okay.
So that's why I had put him between the two.
Okay.
That's okay.
No, I'm glad to talk about that next. But when did your mom pass away in the midst of all that?
My mom passed away in 2000, and my sister took care of her. She was in her home. And the last few months, I would drive every weekend, and we'd go down there and stay with them. But she was in my sister's home, and my sister in fact, they wanted to put Mother in a home, and my sister asked the doctors, so what can they do that I can't do?
Oh, that's true.
And they said nothing, but you know how hard it's going to be. And she said, I'm glad to do it. So Mother was with her, and she died in 2000.
2000, okay.
And my husband's mother, my mother died. 2 weeks later, my husband's mother died.
Oh.
And 2 weeks after that, my mother's sister died.
Wow.
So we lost all of them within a month and a half. So that was hard, but it was not as hard because Mother was 88 and Mother was ready to go home.
Sure.
And she talked about it, and I asked her one day, I mentioned Daddy, and she said, well, I've missed him for 37 years. So
She's
she was
ready to go be with him.
So that does make it easier.
It does, and I think it's a natural order of things is that you expect a parent or someone to pass in those older years, and even though you're going to grieve and you're going to miss them, it doesn't seem as out of order or disorienting. Right. And like you said, your mom got to be there and witness all those milestones, where for you on all those milestones your thoughts were, I wish my dad could be here. Mm-hmm. So I think that's part of it too, for me anyway, is that you got to share in some of those big moments. They were there for those things. I want to say today that I can't tell you how much it means to me that you would come and share that, because you've had a lot in your lifetime. I want to go back to what we said at the beginning, and I'm going to read it. The whole thing, again, that spurred our conversation, or helped me remember how many losses you've suffered. You lost your dad when you were only 18. You lost your sister, who was basically your best friend. I mean, outside of your husband-wife relationship. And then you had a son that you lost. Not only did you, the tragedy of losing him, but in a way that was difficult because it was a suicide. And all that you shared with us on that. But there was a quote you said to me in the parking lot. I'm going to read it. I know you said it earlier, but when you lose your parents, you lose your past. When you lose your spouse, you lose your present. And when you lose your children, it's as if you lost your future. And I just thought, I remember that was so a lot to process and think about. And I just thought that really words what people are going through beautifully. Like it's helpful to have it put like that. And I appreciate that. From that statement, you and I got to talk about, and I was reminded of the losses that you have gone through. And you have been such a lady of grace and one of my heroes. I'm not going to cry. So I will say you are one who has checked on me often, spoken to me at church, and you just have that look in your eye that when you check on people, you know you genuinely care. So I just want to say that I'm gonna stop crying. Okay. I want to say that it has been a privilege to get to interview you and hear your heart of how you have not only come through on the other side of such suffering, but that you have done it with grace and with a great testimony for our Lord.
Thank you.
So I just want to say thanks again.
Thank you.
Love you.
Love you.
Mwah.
We appreciate you joining us today at Speak Your Grief with Sonia. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube as new episodes are added weekly. Thank you again for joining us as we unpack our grief. We hope you have been reminded that you are not alone in this journey.